You're standing on a field soaked in blood. The cries of thousands of wounded soldiers fill the air. The horrors of war unfolding like never before. It's 1859, and on a nearby hill, one man who shouldn't even be there is quietly watching the carnage unfold. This battlefield will change his life forever, and in turn, the entire world. Who was he, and what did he see that no one else could ignore? Sit back, relax, and let me tell you the incredible story of Henry Dunant. This story starts 31 years earlier. We have to go back to the year 1828, where Henry Dunant is born in the Calvinist Republic of Geneva. Henry was born into a family that was quite well off, but who didn't let their wealth distance them from their sense of societal obligation. His father, Jean-Jacques, worked to improve the life of orphans and convicted felons, while his mother, Antoinette, cared for the sick and the poor. Henri's upbringing was steeped in his family's belief in doing good. He helped found the Geneva chapter of the Young Men's Christian Association, probably better known as the YMCA. And he also participated in other forms of charitable and non-profit work. In his 20s, Henri became enchanted by the idea of building something big. Something that could leave a mark on the world. So he quickly turned his attention to French-controlled Algeria, a colonial frontier at the time, and founded the financial and industrial company of the Mills of Mons Jemila. The goal of the company was to develop wheat mills and land for agriculture. But Henri would run into bureaucratic obstacles. The company needed access to water rights, permissions that could only be granted by the French emperor himself, Napoleon III. And no, not Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous conqueror, but his nephew, Louis Napoleon, son of Napoleon Bonaparte's younger brother, Louis Bonaparte. And so, Henri did what few others could even think of. He decided to travel straight to the imperial court, hoping to plead his case in person. In June of 1859, he followed the emperor's movements to northern Italy, where Napoleon was engaged in a campaign against Austria at the time. But what Henri didn't realize was that he was actually headed straight into one of the bloodiest battles of the 19th century. Tired from his journey and waiting for the right opportunity to meet the emperor, Henri stopped near the small town of Solferino, a quiet and remote place he had actually never visited before. But just as he arrived, the hills around Solferino erupted without warning. Like lightning on a clear summer day, the cannon fire cracked through the hills, shaking the ground and piercing the hot summer air. The clash of sabers, the sharp crack of rifles, and the anguished cries of men could be heard for miles. Over 300,000 men had crashed together in a storm of violence, Austrians on one side and the French and Sardinians on the other. Henri had never seen war, and it was nothing like the heroic paintings or romantic headlines in newspapers back home. It was raw, chaotic, and terrifying. He stood frozen, not from fear but from the overwhelming weight of what he saw. It was like watching the world collapsing, and he simply couldn't look away. When the fighting ended, the silence was deafening. The fields were soaked in blood, and there were dying soldiers everywhere. Some barely clinging to life, others begging for mercy or just a sip of water. There were no doctors, no bandages, no one to answer the calls of the dying. Henri was just a businessman on his way to secure a deal. He had no uniform, no orders, and no training whatsoever in either medicine or war. But as the cries of all the severely wounded men became louder, he found himself unable to walk away. He He went from one broken body to another, then another, and then another, urging local villagers to help him. Women from nearby towns followed, bringing linens, wine, or anything they could spare. They set up improvised shelters, and Henri used money out of his own pocket to acquire medical supplies, food, and water. Together they cared for every man they could. French, Austrian, Italian, it made no difference. He heard the whispers of the Italian women tending the wounded.
Tutti fratelli. Tutti fratelli. Tutti fratelli.
Tutti fratelli, meaning all our brothers. Henri could feel something change inside of him. From that moment on, he knew this experience would follow him for the rest of his life. But to truly understand why this moment changed Henry Dunant's life and history as we know it, we have to understand what made the Battle of Solferino so special. Allow me to explain. Solferino wasn't just another clash in the long story of European wars. It was a brutal wake-up call. Around 300,000 soldiers fought in open terrain using outdated Napoleonic tactics, but with increasingly modern weapons. Rifled muskets, artillery with explosive shells, and cavalry charges into withering fire. The result? Tens of thousands killed or maimed in a single day. Modern firepower had caught up with outdated tactics and with brutal consequences. Now, let's head back to Henri's home in Geneva, as he did after the battle. Back home, Henri couldn't shake off what he had witnessed. Determined to share it, he decided to write a book about his experience. Then, after 3 years of writing, the book was finally completed, and its title, Un souvenir de Solferino, or in English, A Memory of Solferino. But the book was a lot more than a memoir. It was a passionate call to action. In it, Henri asked bold yet simple questions. What if every country had voluntary relief organizations ready to help the wounded in war? What if medics and aid workers were protected, no matter what side they served? And Dunant went on to personally finance and publish his own book, a clear sign of his commitment to fix what he had seen so tragically broken. Henri acquired hundreds of copies and sent them to people with real influence. Kings, generals, diplomats and politicians. One copy landed in the hands of Gustave Moynier, president of the Geneva Society for Public Welfare. Moynier was struck by the book. Dunant's idea of neutral humanitarian relief felt not just possible, but necessary. Inspired by Dunant's words and driven by a shared urgency, Moynier, Dunant and 3 other like-minded men gathered in Geneva in February of 1863. United by the belief that compassion could be organized even amidst war, they formed the Committee of Five. Joining Henri and Gustave was Guillaume Henri Dufour, a Swiss general respected all across Europe, Louis Appia, a surgeon who had seen the horrors of war firsthand, and Theodore Monnois, a doctor with a deep belief in organized medical aid. Then later that year they organized an international conference in Geneva, drawing representatives from 16 different countries across Europe. In the months leading up to the conference, Henri had traveled across Europe at his own expense, personally urging governments to take part. By the time the delegates gathered, the 5 men had already laid the groundwork for what would soon become the International Committee of the Red Cross. They had also, based on Henri's book, proposed a legal framework for their vision. Each country should establish voluntary relief societies, and an international agreement should protect the wounded and those who aid them. This vision, driven by Dunant's moral clarity and guided by Moynier's political skill, took shape just a year later with the signing of the first Geneva Convention in 1864. And just like that, for the first time in history, international law guaranteed protection for the wounded in battle and those who provided aid to them. While Henri's ideas were reshaping the world, his own life quietly unraveled. He had neglected his business to pursue his humanitarian vision, and the consequences soon caught up with him. Lawsuits, bankruptcy, and exile from Geneva's social elite followed. Gustave Moynier thought that Henri's bankruptcy could be damaging to the image of the International Committee of the Red Cross and decided to try to distance Henri from the organization. So, for decades, Henri moved from one modest home to another, poor and alone, forgotten by the world he once tried to heal. In 1895, journalist Georg Baumberger of the Swiss newspaper Die Ostschweiz discovered Henry Dunant in the small village of Heiden, where he had been living in poverty for years. Baumberger interviewed him and published an article titled Henry Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross, on September 8, 1895. The article rekindled global interest and the world finally took notice. In 1901, Dunant was awarded the very first Nobel Peace Prize. And he didn't use the prize money for personal comfort. Instead, he donated it to charity and spent his final years in Heiden Hospital, a modest institution for the poor. He also donated a generous portion of his prize, 15,000 Norwegian crowns each, to the Norwegian Red Cross and the Norwegian Women's Public Health Association. It was his way of giving back to the country that had honored him. So, on behalf of Norway, I would like to say, takk. When he died in 1910, his final words reflected the quiet faith that had guided his life. I am a disciple of Christ as in the early centuries, and nothing more. And yet, his legacy endures. When disaster or war strikes, like in Syria, Gaza, Sudan or Ukraine, and relief teams arrive with food, water and compassion, we must remember the man who made it all possible. Regardless of the brutality of war, Henri reminds us that human compassion still prevails. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Footnotes in History. And if you or someone you know volunteers for the Red Cross, remember to thank them. Not just for their service, but for keeping Henry Dunant's legacy of compassion and humanity alive. Until our next journey through time, remember, history is closer than you think.